What is up guys, Alex here, and today I want to give you 4 pieces of advice on how to make your track sound more interesting, less predictable, and how to build the tension in your tracks to make the listeners go, oh my god! So, yeah, this tutorial is not going to be one of those practical how-tos, although like this information is really useful if you're having the trouble of writing things that are too much predictable and lose the listener's attention, or if you have the opposite trouble of writing stuff that is way too much complex because you want to impress the listener, but you end up just confusing them because they are hard to follow. So I'm going to tell you with this track here what I do to make my tracks more interesting and surprising to the listeners who still get them and enjoy them, I'm going to tell you how to go about the middle way. So for the purpose of this tutorial, I'm going to use this track, which is called Codename Highwind. Most of you might already know this track. It's one of the first tracks I posted on this same YouTube channel back in 2015. So yeah, it's quite old, so it's not as good as my latest one, but it's a great example to use on for explaining the 4 pieces of advice I want to share with you today. So as a first thing, we're going to listen to the whole track and then I'm going to dissect it so that I can give you the 4 pieces of advice and show you what I mean while we, analyze the track. But I should give you a warning, like this is not a tutorial based on how to orchestrate or how to compose. This is based on how to handle energy, interest, and tension in such a way to create, to breathe life into your track and make it enticing and challenging for the listeners. So if you're interested in that stuff, okay, this tutorial is for you. But if you're interested in learning how to compose and orchestrate, there are other tutorials about that in this same YouTube channel, so maybe go check those out. So I'm playing the track in 3, 2, 1. So as you might have heard, like this track had quite some stuff happening into it, and it varies quite a lot. And I'm going to explain to you how I managed to put all this stuff into it without making the listener feel lost or feel bored while the track went on, because I used a few techniques here and there to make it flow and make it breathe and move. So that is what I'm going to explain to you today. I'm not going to talk about orchestration and all that stuff, because I already explained about that in other tutorials. And by the way, if you want to learn how to write cinematic music like this more in depth and more precise and academic way, you should definitely check out the new Evident course on cinematic music, because my friend Arn Anderson, who is a great composer, made this course where he explained every single thing about the orchestra and how to go about MIDI sequencing and all that good stuff. And it's really great. It's an updated version of a course I took myself back in the day from him, which taught me a lot, but now it's even much better. So you should definitely check that out if you want to learn this kind of stuff. Link is in my description of this video. Anyway, without further ado, let's get into the 4 techniques or mindsets I use to write this track in such an interesting way. And by the way, you do not have to use these techniques slash mindset in every single track you make, but if you want to write something like this, they're going to help you a lot. So the first advice or technique is based on a psychological effect of the mind of human beings, which I heard about from a music producer on YouTube, which is the Gestalt of how our ears perceive sound. So, or rather, how our brain perceives sound. So, say for example, you're working in nature, and the first thing you might hear is the sound of distant birds, singing. So your brain is focused on the singing of the birds. After a while, you start hearing the sound of maybe cars passing by in the distance. So what happens is that the brain does not actively listens to the birds and the cars together. What happens is that the brain takes the sound that you heard before and it puts it in the background, You still hear it, but you're not focused. The attention of the brain is not focused on the birds, it's focused on the new sound, which it heard after, so the car. So when you hear the birds and car together, the birds are in the background, you're still aware of them in a way, but your brain is only focused on the car. And maybe after the car, you hear the sound of the wind blowing on the leaves. So even the car now come in the background along with the birds, and the sound that your brain is actively listening to is the new one instead, which is the sound of the leaves. So how can we make use of this Gestalt to our advantage as musicians? So one way you can make use of this is to make sure that when the listener heard something in your track and puts it in the background after a few seconds, you have some new information to provide his brain to keep his attention, It's pretty much like in movies and cartoons when maybe they want to chase a dog away, they throw sausages at the dog, So they throw one sausage and then they back off, and the dog chases the sausage, eats the sausage, and then it stands there. When the dog stands there, it's pretty much the equivalent of you putting a sound in the background of your mind. So, or rather, the listener putting the sound in the background of his mind. So to keep his attention, you need to throw another sausage far away, So you throw in another type of sound. And what I did here is I have this pulse, which plays for a while. When it gets predictable, because the brain is able to recognize the pattern in it and puts it in the background, I introduce new elements. So here I have a pulse. Here I introduce a new pulse and some string spiccati. Just as the first pulse started to get predictable, I introduced new stuff so that the dog keeps running after the sausages, so that the listener keeps actively engaged. And in here I did the same. You can still hear what was introduced before, you still hear the pulses, the string spiccati, but you're going to hear a new string spiccati and a string tremolo playing as well. So it keeps being interesting because it keeps flowing and new stuff keeps getting introduced for the brain to be stimulated with. And then in here I added some brass. And this is basic knowledge. It's common sense to write music this way, but this is a basic rule you need to keep in mind for 2 reasons. The first reason is that when a listener listens to a track, he or she wants to be kept by hand, The track, yes, it needs to evolve. You need to present new information all the time, but you still need to preserve what you said before in the track. So that as the track evolves, as the brain has new information to catch, it still holds on to something, Good music, for example, pop music is so easy to understand and easy to get into because it throws at you so many, handles, so many things to hold on to, there's the usual chord progression. Like if you hear a pop song, there's typically a catchy chord progression that you keep in your head as the song goes throughout, and the song keeps playing that chord progression, so that you keep holding on to that chord progression as it progresses without getting lost. Like this is something important to do for your listeners. Like you do not want your track to keep evolving randomly and without giving the listener anything to hold on to while the track evolves. You want the track to evolve continuously, but while preserving that sense of, safety, right? By keeping the listener by hand, as I say all the time. So one way you can do this is to make sure that the background information, that you preserve some of the background information that you fed to the listener before. And background information can be, harmonic information, it can be a rhythm, it can be sounds. So in here, it's mostly, I kept the same rhythm going on all the time, and I kept the same sounds. So yeah, you should keep in mind that first thing. And the second reason why you should keep in mind the effect of, the Gestalt is that is the opposite, actually. One other way to impress a listener, to keep the track interesting is to play with the listener's expectations. So in here, we built all this background information. So now the listener would expect that new elements would be thrown at him while maintaining what we said up until that point, right? But no, like in this part here, what happens is that I take all the information that was presented before and I throw it away and introduce new ones, So what happens is that suddenly the brain doesn't hear that background sounds that have been processed up until the point. Suddenly, I remove my hand from the hands of the listener, so he feels a bit, startled. So that's what happens here. Like when someone listens to this track for the first time, when this part comes, like he or she is taken by surprise because he doesn't expect, this change. And this is great, for especially if you need to transition your track from one part to another. It's good to let go of whatever was said up until this point and introduce new elements which sound completely different. So that's what I did here. Like I broke rapport with everything else and I put this new section here, which is a bridge to the next section. But before this section became predictable and went in the background of the mind of the listener, or the background of the brain of the listener, I brought back the information that was presented before the bridge. So let's hear this passage. So when this part comes in, like the listener is initially confused because it's so different from what it heard before. But even this, it can get processed after a while and just gets in the background of, the brain. So before that happened, I made sure to change the track again by, putting back the elements that we heard before. So I brought back the pulses and the string spiccati and the string tremolo as well, stuff like that. But I didn't only introduce those, I even added other stuff, like this arpeggio here. For example. And other stuff like new pulses and blah, blah, blah. So, yeah, you can use this Gestalt effect in these two ways, to create a sense of safety or to remove it completely for a few seconds. And the contrast between, the expectations that you respect and the expectations that you do not fulfill and do not respect instead is what will make your track more interesting or less interesting, Sometimes, like, you need to be a bit predictable while you introduce new elements, You need to leave some of that background information when introducing new elements. Other times, if you want really to surprise your listener, you can take that predictable side of your track and put it away completely for a few seconds, and then put it back again. So yeah, you can do this by creating bridges like this, or by maybe inserting a little bit of silence or a bit of gaps, stuff like that. So keep that in mind. So the second tip is very much more practical and easier to understand, which is to make your track more interesting, you should make its element breathe, For example, in the strings here, which I added on the first few patterns, like this is what the strings sound like. Which is okay, but to make the track flow more, I took these strings, like I recorded one string spiccato, and I reversed it this way to create this sound. So it leads you into the strings before they come in, This is what they sound like. It drags you in, and this is a very little detail you can use to make, for example, the strings here sound more enticing, because it drags you in all the time. It's really subtle, but it helps make them flow more. And then I did the same with the brass by adding some scoops. So, do that kind of stuff, use those reverse swells and scoops and stuff like that. Then, to make the track flow more and to make it more, to make it breathe more and stuff like that, it's good sometimes to play with EQs, Let's analyze the pulses which we have here, which are, I think, 2. So like there is this pulse, let's check out what is happening here. So as you can see, I have 2 equalizers, and there are some automations and stuff which are moving the equalizer's bands. Again, this is like a super small detail, but it really helps into making the track flow more and breathe more, It's not like I put this sample and I just slammed it there with no changes at all, I put the sample, I slammed it there, but then I moved the EQ, so the sound, as the sound goes, it moves, and the characteristics kind of change, even in a subtle way, but they do change, and it sounds a bit more interesting. And even if all of this, tweaks here, like for example, this reverse strings thing, the brass scoop and the EQ that moves, are just subtle, when you put the effect of all of them together, it really adds up to something good, It sounds more interesting. And then after that pulse, we have another pulse here, and this is cooler, It's still a subtle thing, but it's great. So let's hear it. So as you heard, it comes in really quiet because I put this bandpass filter, which I draw with the EQ, and I draw some automations to make it move as this bridge progresses. So what happens is that initially we hear the first pulse clearly. This first pulse fades out a little bit because of the EQ, and this other pulse, it starts to open up and open up until the last bar of this, or rather the last bit of this bridge. So like it comes in shy and shy, and then it becomes bigger and bigger, and then it just takes over, And that's another thing you can do. Like you can use 2 different pulses and then mix them together, fade one out and fade one in, and like you can go crazy however you want it. Like, this is really simple stuff actually, but yeah. And another thing I did is, you know, in here I went a bit crazy, I think. I have this sound here. Oops. This sound here. Which is actually something like this. Like, this is the raw sound. So what I did here, like you see, I have some many EQs and stuff. So you know, you have, like, you can take a sample like this one and you can edit it by EQing it and stuff like that. And like, this track is so old, I don't remember so well what I did here, but I remember one thing. Like, here I have a distortion module, which this is the volume here in FL Studio. This means the it's pretty much the dry wet knob of this effect. And I draw an automation so that as this sound goes, the dry, like the distortion comes in and off. So this is what it sounds like. And then I added some reverb after it and stuff like that. So without the distortion and without the reverb, this is with the distortion. And then I added some reverb. So, you know, you can just play with sounds, mess around with stuff, and don't think that I knew what I was doing when I was doing this. You know, I was just trying to make it more interesting by playing with EQs, playing with effects, distortion, and automating them. So that's another thing you can do, you know, automate stuff, you know, don't keep things too much static, you know, make them more interesting this way. And yeah, that's one thing you can do. You can add all kinds of details to make the track flow more in this way. So the third tip is pre-announce change, which means use risers, downers, trailer hits, and all that stuff to pre-announce that something is going to change. Because those are very subliminal cues you can send to the listener's brain that to create some tension and expectation for something to come, you know? For example, here. Like, you feel it subliminally that something is going to change because of the riser. If I removed it, like, okay, wait, let's remove the trailer hits as well. So, say for example, we have this without risers or trailer hits. The listener is going to be like, what the fuck happened, you know? I didn't expect that. Not that he really needs to completely expect that, but you still need to feed some hints that stuff is about to change. That is why it feels a bit void if I do not put the trailer hits and the risers. So another way I signal change in this track is, for example, this sound here at the end. This thing here. Like, you hear it only here at the end of this bar, and when you hear it coming, it's new and you think, wow, something is changing, you know? And it does change because this bridge ends. And then below that, I also have this riser here. So these two elements keep this part flowing and going, and they basically tell your brain that this is not a stable part, that things are going to change and that you are to expect change. So yeah, you need to play with the brains of people like that. And my best example of pre-announcing change is this part here. So in here there were like the tension was big because there was like a big riser, which is this one. But not only that, we also had Grossbeat doing some glitchy stuff. So let's analyze the Grossbeat. So let's analyze, for example, the pulses. The pulses here have a steady rhythm along with everything else. Everything follows the rhythm of the pulses. So your brain again has the knowledge in the background of what the rhythm is. But what happens is that when the gross beat kicks in this part here, the rhythm gets a bit stuttered and glitchy like this. And it gets you by surprise, Sorry, what did I do? Anyway, it gets you by surprise, and it really, it's a subtle change, but still unexpected. And for a few seconds, your brain is not able to sync to the rhythm that it felt before because it gets destroyed by the gross beat. And that is a great way to announce change, create some feels that break the rhythm or some glitches, this way. They do not need to be too long because you do not want your listeners to be confused for too much time because of the reason I explained in the first advice, in the first tip. But if you put this kind of stuff at the end of a section, it's a great way to break the expectation of a listener and pre-announce the change. So along, like the risers along with the glitches here create that cool, unexpected feel of something new coming. And in fact, after that, something new comes in, which is this part with the strings and the guitar and stuff like that, which I'm going to tell you about now in the fourth tip. The fourth tip is don't be afraid to use or introduce elements of completely different nature in your track. For example, in here, we have this part which has strings and guitar and some vocals, which are much more atmospheric than all the rest of the track. And this is something I saw doing from the composer Daniel James, who is a great composer who sometimes live streams his compositions. And when he composes, he tends to write, this hard-hitting synthetic stuff, but that at a certain point in the track become atmospheric, emotional, and very much orchestral. And it's what they did here. Like here we had all the pulses, synthetic, strange effects here and rhythms and hard hitting and rhythmic stuff. And instead in here we have sustained, atmospheric, calm, and dynamic things. So the contrast between these two parts is really interesting and unexpected. So that's one other thing you want in your tracks: contrast between the sections. It's good to have a calm breakdown in the track, or if the track is calm, it's good to have a more aggressive part into it after a while. So yeah, this is the calm part of Codename High Wind. And again, to make it interesting, like I said in the first point, I introduced elements by elements. So this part starts with some strings and some pulse, like a minimal pulse, which introduces a bit of rhythm, and some guitar playing, some notes, and it sets the atmosphere. But then after a while, I thought, okay, maybe this is going to get boring, so I need to introduce new elements. And I introduce a vocal from, that sounds much far away, but you still hear it. And then to make, the interest peak, the coolest thing you can do is to introduce a solo, or a melody, like this guitar solo / melody I introduce here. Like, when the attention was fading away, the guitar solo came in and it grabbed it back, And then after that, I added some ethnic drums. And the guitar solo kept going on. So the interest is kept up until the end. So yeah, the fourth tip is introduce elements of different nature to provide a fresh sound. Because if I kept this synthetic and rhythmic like the first part of the track, it would have been harder for me to make the rest of the track sound interesting. Then after this calm part, we have the synthetic stuff coming back. But if it's even here, the synthetic stuff sounds good and interesting because before it we had this calm and atmospheric and organic side of the track. So the fourth tip is create contrast in your track by varying, the nature of some of the parts of the structure. Make some parts of the structure more calm, make other parts more aggressive, and also changing the instrumentation from one part of the structure to another, like I did here, is a good, way to make your track sound interesting and to make it flow more seamlessly. This track doesn't bore people when they listen to it, I think, because it's so much variable and it has so many of these four tips that I gave you. They're used so many times, and that is, in my opinion, the reason why this track sounds so enticing. Maybe there are other reasons which I'm not aware of, probably, and maybe there are some things I forgot because I wrote this like 1.5 years ago, or maybe even more. So to recap, the first tip is use the Gestalt concept to make the track evolve around the listener without making him or her feeling lost, but also use it to surprise him or to confuse him for a little bit in such a way to even grab his attention more. Second tip, try to add some details, play with EQ, play with effects, try to add some reverse sounds like I did with the strings, stuff like that to make your track breathe more. Third tip, try to pre-announce change. Use risers, downers, effects, and glitches and drum fills to make the jumps from the transitions from one part of the structure to another more, to make them flow more, to make them more interesting. And fourth tip, try to make your track variable in its instrumentation and in the way you write it. Have aggressive parts, have calm parts, have that contrast, because the loudness of a track is also given by the difference between the peak of the track and the calmest part of the track. So try to make your track have that contrast between hot and cold, loud and calm. By the way, if I forgot to mention something, as I probably have, feel free to ask me questions about this song or this tutorial that you might have, and please give me some feedback on this tutorial. Let me know if you think I've been rambling without providing knowledge and stuff, because it's really easy for me to get lost while I talk and while I explain these kind of subjects, because this is quite second nature to me now, so it's really weird to put it in words. And when you internalize something like this, you kind of start to believe that everyone else knows these concepts just as you, because they are so evident, but that might not be the case. So if this tutorial helped you, please let me know, so that maybe I can make more of these modus operandi driven tutorials. And if instead it did not help you and felt like a waste of time, I'm sorry. And yeah, let me know that as well, so that I can maybe avoid doing stuff like this again in the future. But yeah, one last thing, if you want to learn how to write music like this, cinematic music, yeah, keep in tune with this tutorial channel, because yeah, I'm going to post a lot of new tutorials, and there are quite a few already, others which are much more practical than this one, on orchestration, on how to write music for strings and stuff like that. And another thing I suggest you to do is to check out the new Evident course on cinematic music, because yeah, it is quite expensive, but it's completely worth the cost, because that course has been out for less than a month, and it's already exploding in recognition and good comments from people who take it, because it's so filled with lots of gold information about the orchestra, about producing and writing orchestral music and composing, starting from a simple idea and ending with a fully orchestrated and beautiful track. So I really suggest you to check that one out, and the link is in my description if you want to take that course. And yeah, that will be all for today. Alex out.